We're going to go through the kind of conception of this project to where we're at to date this evening, and then we'll leave some time to go through some questions if you have any. I'll be going through kind of the immediate introduction, kind of the reason why this site was chosen, and how we came to the proposal that we did, and then some of the consultants will be going through the data collection and analysis phases. So this project kind of began almost a year ago, more I'm sure. Woods Hole Group contracted with the trustees to do an inundation study of all their properties in the Commonwealth. And as a result of that study, the Crane Estate was identified as their most vulnerable asset in the Commonwealth due to that study, which the inundation study looked at the effects of sea level rise over the course of the next 50 years or so. And that's, sorry, I kind of jumped into that, yeah, sorry. And so this map shows that. This map is also out back if you want to get a closer look at it. It shows the darker blue is the what's expected in 2030, and the lighter blue is what's expected in 2070 for elevation of your high tides. That puts a significant portion of the road underwater, as we kind of know what happens from time to time today. But you know, it'll be more frequent, possibly happening every tide cycle. Certainly in the 2070, it'll be every tide cycle. So they got that information and they approached the town, seeing the condition of that section of road from the entrance to the beach was in dire need of some repair anyways. So the two of us teamed up and put a proposal into the Coastal Zone Management to try to get a grant to evaluate raising the road using soft solutions as shoulder stabilization methods, and we'll go through what some of that is later on in the presentation. So what we've gotten for a grant is to get us to a 30% design. 30% design is kind of looking at what some of the options are, and we're hoping to hone it down to one or two to really consider moving forward. But we are looking at a wide range of options initially, just to see what some of our controlling points might be on how high they could raise it. Something like the culvert, they evaluate that culvert to see if it's sized properly for the tidal flow that we'll see, and we'll go from there. So some of the data collection work, there was a lot of data collection work. Some of it was just doing something as simple as a survey, just existing condition survey. And then they also looked at the subsurface of the road base. They'll get into that in more detail just to see what's under the road, what's supporting the road today. Is that enough to support the road if they're to raise it, you know, 2 feet or so? Is that road base sufficient for that, or is there sub-base issues beyond the road that we'll look at? So with that, I guess I'll pass it over to some of these folks to chat about the data collection process and some of those specific steps that were taken that they took to get the data that they can then analyze some of the treatments, some of the road treatments.
So we will, so my name is Ted Whitcourt. I'm from Woods Hole Group. This is my colleague Matt Schultz, also from Woods Hole Group, and Jen Ducey from Stantec. So there's the timeline for this project. We had the project kickoff, and then this fall we've been pretty active out at the site collecting numerous data sets, which we'll talk about in a moment. We've done some data analysis. This is our first public meeting, and we're really starting kind of deep in the weeds, so to speak, looking at the alternative road designs and the side slopes and hydrodynamic modeling and that kind of work. So we thought it was a good time to have a public meeting to let everyone know what's going on, and then we'll follow this up with a meeting in June where we'll talk about our recommendations going forward. Just so it's clear, this year is not going to end up with any changes to the road. This is a long process. I'm sure a number of you have been through this process before. So we're in the early stages, but as Frank said, they'll end up with a 30% design. So with that, I think Jen's going to talk a little bit about the site survey. existing condition survey.
Right, so as Frank alluded to, we had our survey crews out from Meridian Associates, and they went out there and did a field survey. Did anyone here see them out there? I don't know if any of the public was out there. So they use pretty traditional survey methods, but essentially they were looking at all the surface features, and they do record plan review to figure out what's below the road. So as part of that, we end up with an AutoCAD base plan, which would show us everything from the existing lane widths out there, what the side slopes look like, where the water main is. There's actually a water main underneath this road that feeds out to the bathhouse out at the out at the beach. And they were out there first. They also coincided their efforts with the delineation work that Woods Hole Group did, which is the next slide here.
So the wetland survey is a really important step, both from a permitting perspective, but also from a design perspective, because we want to understand what's out there now, how our project might improve, and we want to make sure that our project doesn't make conditions worse. We knew that from an ecological standpoint, the water flow through the existing culvert was not enough to help the wetland survive and grow as it should. So that was the ecological aspect behind this project. So what we did, we had a certified wetland scientist go out and delineate the extent of the different types of wetlands, create a map, and that was transferred to the AutoCAD that Jen talked about, so that we know where we can do work and where permits, where we're going to have to talk to the regulatory agencies about the work we want to do.
Okay. We also collected tide data in the system. You can see the two locations where we collected data, both upstream of the roadway and downstream of the roadway. And the purpose here was really to establish, characterize existing conditions, what the tidal conditions are in the upstream marsh, and also if the existing culvert was sized correctly so that you have full tidal exchange into that marsh. So that's what you see there in the upper right-hand corner is a time series of tides. And you can see the black line is the minimum elevation of Argilla Road. So during the period of data collection, I believe it was the end of September to the end of October, you can see there were a couple instances where tide elevations did exceed the elevation of the roadway. And you can't really see it from this plot, but the tides on the upstream side are somewhat restricted by the culvert. It's a minimal restriction. So we were able to get that from the tide data collection that we had out there. And that just shows the instrument that was placed in the creek bed to collect tides for a period of over 30 days.
Yep, and the last item of kind of field inventory and data collection work that we did was actually a boring program. Whether you're boring or geotechnical investigation or subsurface investigation, it all means the same thing. Thank you, Carol, for taking wonderful photos of our boring crews out here. I was saying I actually haven't gotten out on a lot of these boring sites during these operations to see what it looks like, so I actually appreciated seeing all those photos, so thank you. So they drilled 5 test borings over the course of 2 days out in October. They went down to depths between 17 to 26 feet out there, and essentially the goal was to figure out what the substrate looked like. So clearly you know what the pavement looks like on the top, portion of the roadway below it is built on fill, and then below there you could actually figure out kind of the marsh bottom, and then also there's a layer of clay beneath that. So in that kind of 17 to 26 inch vertical profile, we were able to figure out all this information, so that as we look at kind of raising the road and other alternatives that we're looking at, that's going to form the basis for our design moving forward.
So, as Frank mentioned, part of the project was looking at the culvert under the roadway. We're raising the culvert, or we're raising the roadway, so it makes sense to kind of look at the sizing of the culvert. So, in order to look at potential different alternatives to the existing culvert, we needed to develop a tidal hydraulics model. So that really will inform what the correct culvert size should be, as well as the potential for salt marsh restoration upstream of the roadway. So we developed a one-dimensional model of the creek and the culvert system, and we try to model the model setup. So we try to recreate the measurements that were made. So we had the tidal measurements, so the models, we're trying to calibrate and validate our model to those measurements. And there is a weir structure that's upstream of the roadway, which controls a lot of the elevations in the marsh. So that was one additional thing that we learned in doing the modeling. And that weir structure will be removed as part of the project as well. So the model's set up to look at different culvert sizes, and then we run the model for the typical tidal conditions, and then we're also evaluating the culvert under a sea level rise condition or multiple sea level rise scenarios. So what we were able to learn from running a number of different simulations was that the existing culvert was slightly undersized, and we recommended replacing the culvert. Currently is an 8x5 culvert, so 8 feet wide by 5 feet high, and we're recommending that we replace it with a 10-foot wide culvert that's 8 feet high as well. And so that will restore the full tidal flow to the upstream marsh. And you can see this figure shows the potential area of salt marsh restoration. It's about just over an acre of salt marsh that would be restored by replacing the culvert. And then the modeling helped inform additional culvert work that we did.
Right, so kind of the next couple of slides kind of focus on the culvert itself and then the roadway design. So the culvert, not as glamorous a picture as some of the other ones, but this is a typical kind of precast box culvert design. So again, having the dimensions of 10 feet wide by 8 feet tall that Matt had mentioned. And so what we're looking at is, one of 3 different alternatives. This would be what we'd call a 4-sided box. Clearly, it has 4 sides all around it. A 3-sided box would have an open bottom, and then we're also looking at kind of dual culverts side by side. We're still working through our analysis of all those options right now. What's kind of weighing into, what will elevate one alternative over another alternative will pretty much come down to kind of the goals here, which is, trying to, minimize the tidal flow interruption during construction, the actual time period of that construction, because depending upon what type of culvert you use, there's different means and methods that contractors will use to construct these. And then thinking about not only just the culvert itself, but being able to maintain access to the beach, both for, just visitors as well as for emergency access needs. So we're weighing all those different aspects in, and then most importantly, the ecological considerations. So we're coordinating not only with CZM and Alicia here with the Conservation Commission, Catherine from CZM, but also we're looking to talk to folks at Natural Heritage and Endangered Species, and also with the Division of Marine Fisheries to get an idea of what kind of species we're dealing with in the tidal creek and how that will actually impact our culvert alternative selection. So the roadway, so it's about 2,500 linear feet, about half a mile, give or take, that we're looking at, all the way from the main entrance up to the estate, all the way out to approximately the guard shack. And based on the modeling that was done, the recommendation was to actually elevate that roadway. I think we were talking, 2.3 feet, give or take, up to an elevation 9. And clearly when you look up at the photo at the top right, you don't really see an issue. Typical people traveling to the beach are like, this is great, wide open roadway traveling out to the beach. But then when you see the photo that we had on the cover slide here, clearly, during storm events, it's a different situation. So if you flip to the next slide here, we can kind of see what we're looking at. So right now, the existing roadway is kind of 2 11-foot lanes with 2-foot shoulders. So that's an existing paved width of, say, 13 feet. We're not looking to try to widen that. There's not sufficient space to do so, because you do have those wetland resource areas at the TOA slope on both sides. And elevating the roadway to kind of get it up and out of those kind of sea level rise projections ultimately mean that we have to slope down on the sides to be able to tie back into kind of existing ground. Adding to the conversation about what the preferred alternative is here, we have that existing water line that I had mentioned that feeds out to the beach house. And there's actually utility poles out there too along one side of the roadway. So these are all items that we're kind of taking into account to say, okay, we know we want to raise the roadway. We know we want to maintain, vehicular access. What's the best way to kind of get this constructed? So right now, this is kind of the typical section that we're looking at. And I guess this is my slide again, sorry. For geotechnical, a good portion of that, I had mentioned that there was that kind of the fill materials, and then there's also the peat materials and the clay layer underneath. And what's interesting about that is over time, there's anticipation that there's going to be some settlement along that roadway. It's not unusual for any coastal environment. The clay layer is what's causing that. In a lot of the coastal projects that we're working on, roadways and parks along the waterfront, there's been settlement over time. So we wanted to make sure that as we took that geotechnical information in, and as we looked at that roadway raising, we knew that there would be some settlement over time and how we could actually incorporate that into the construction staging, as you hear the way that the contractor will construct it. And we're looking at a few different options to try to minimize the impacts of that settlement, which would likely occur over about a 1-year time frame.
So one of the big challenges and also one of the exciting aspects of this project is trying to figure out how to use living shorelines on the side slopes of the road to both stabilize the road but also maintain the ecological function of the wetland. So we are, in some way, in many ways, we're breaking new ground, the trustees in the town of Ipswich and CZM, and trying to figure out how to build resiliency in a road that goes right through a salt marsh without creating new damage to that salt marsh. So living shorelines, when you hear about this project, I think that'll be one of the aspects that jumps to the forefront. So what we're doing now is working with Stantec and with our modelers to try to figure out what living shoreline designs might work in the salt marsh. Again, current regulations won't allow us to do much on the side slope, so we have to figure out a way to work within the regulations to build stability into the side slope. So we have a few options that we've been considering here. So option A is kind of a standard embankment or berm, and you'll see that it has woody vegetation and a slope that meets the requirements for stability on the side slope. And you'll also see on all the options, you'll see this little bit right here, and that recognizes that there will be some wetland damage created from construction, so that area will be restored. You'll see that on all the options, or all the alternatives. Next one. So if we were constrained in having a slope that goes further out into the wetland, we'd have to come up with some kind of wall system to give the stability. This option, I think, is off the table at this point, but it is just showing how we might have to consider using some option that really cuts the slope and maintains the stability. Option C, again, this is a harder landscape harder design than we necessarily want, but it just shows what a stone revetment would look like. So you have smaller stones and larger stones above that. And then getting into the ones that, option D, next one. Option D shows a terracing approach, which is something that we think could work. The gabion terraces, they're kind of wire mesh, stone-filled structures that go at the toe of each of the terraces. Again, this is a little bit harder of a structure than we would necessarily prefer, but it shows how a terraced approach might work to build out that stability. And then finally, option E is a softer version of the terraced approach. We have core logs, which are fiber-filled materials that go at the toe and will help build stability. And then we have the plantings at the different levels. Again, we have a rock toe for stabilization. All these options are still, we're still kind of exploring different combinations, try to figure out how we can create this living shoreline in the most helpful way, I guess, for the wetland. Ultimately, I think we're going to choose 2 of the options, and we're going to implement a monitoring program so we can try to figure out which of these options holds up the best and how through maintenance we can keep these options functioning. So that's the living shoreline component of the project.
So the next steps for this project, these timelines are estimated if kind of funding was available immediately. This project is currently funded through a grant to get us through this 30% design. There is no future town funding earmarked for this project. We will at this point continue to seek grant funding where possible to try to keep this moving forward. But the next step would be to continue the design from the 30% to 100% design and permitting, which would require several state and federal agencies to have a chance to review and give comments to what we're trying to propose. As Ted said, a lot of it is new, not technically regulated to go into a salt marsh like we're proposing here, so we will be breaching that subject with them at some point to see if there's a method that can be used to achieve this or not. So with that said, you know, a lot of this is going to be based on what is available for grant funding and how competitive our applications are compared to other projects within the Commonwealth. Part of what will be a deliverable on this project is kind of these technical memos on how we took each of these steps and got to each point we did, so that hopefully that's transferable to other projects in the Commonwealth if other communities are trying to achieve raising a salt marsh, raising a road to a salt marsh, as we're proposing on Argilla Road. And again, just to reiterate, this project is a partnership with the trustees in the town. The trustees actually have paid the town's in-kind match. Not to say that we're not also working on it with some hours of in-kind match, but they did step up, and I think that's part of what made our application stronger than maybe some others, is that we're paying, not only just doing the in-kind match with the town's time and resources, but the trustees found the money to fund our portion of it, which gets us a little bit further along than maybe if we were just using the town's resources as in-kind match. So that's very helpful, and can't thank not only these folks enough for the work they're doing, but I do want to thank the trustees and all their staff for helping out, especially Carol, who's been out there taking all of those photos you saw.
If I know this, I actually have a video. I walked through the culvert. I'm not sure if that's legal to do. If I thought about it, I would have put it right in there.
But beyond that, she really helped with this, with putting the PowerPoint together and getting everything. So, so we're at this point that we are. With that said, we'll open it up to any questions or comments that people may have. This PowerPoint I can certainly provide it if anyone wants a copy of it. We can get it to you.
Well, a question came up when you were just discussing the culvert and whether, you know, looking at different alternatives like a sloping or stepped approach. And I wondered if you have, is the aesthetic component part of what you consider with any of these alternatives? Do you have somebody that, I mean, this is an extraordinarily beautiful area, and I should think the aesthetic component would be an important component to be thinking about with everything that you do.
It is something that we are thinking about.
Yeah.
To take it as far as where they've evaluated possibly putting those power lines on the line underground.
Yeah.
Probably not going to happen with the, you know, the cost of that associated with the cost of this project, but that's something that we are looking at, being sensitive to the fact that, you know, that you're driving through the marsh to get to the beach, and it's really, everyone's going there for the view, and you know, that does take away from it. But so we are considering that. Nothing that we really do on the side slope should hopefully be too impactful to, you know, as you're driving by. Obviously, if you're walking the road, it'll be more noticeable, but most of the stuff will be from the road grade down. I don't think you'll see guardrails or anything of that sort, you know, to take away from the aesthetics. Yes?
So how does it work where the road comes to the end by the gate?
They would transition it back down to the gravel parking lot, so you.
I see. So it would extend right into the parking lot at this height?
Pretty close to that. They start transitioning down before the parking lot. They're gonna have to meet the grade of that gatehouse, where they could probably bring it up a little bit, but you know, that gatehouse isn't being raised, so you know, they gotta get back to that level by the gatehouse essentially.
I see. Okay. And is that whole area that's being restored, is that Phragmites now, and just with more water, it'll just coming in? You showed that slide of the,
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's all
It's not all
Phragmites,
Phragmites.
but there is a couple of good stands of Phragmites. The slide where they showed the salt marsh restoration, that
Yeah.
was based on just increasing the culvert along
Increasing
and
water.
increasing flow to the area.
yeah, okay.
So that, that slide I think is a pretty good slide, or a pretty good graphic just to
That
show.
one, yeah.
Just by simply replacing the culvert, if we didn't touch the road, you could possibly open up,
Sure,
I think it was about an acre of additional salt marsh in the
Yeah.
area. We feel that if we do the project in conjunction with that, there are other opportunities to maybe even make that a little bit more of a restoration. If we're doing some of the restoration as part of the work, beyond just
Yeah.
letting nature do its thing on this part. So. Any other questions or comments?
What do you think the expected total cost of this kind of project is?
That's a good question. I really don't have an idea. I'd hate to say a number that would shock anyone. I could, looking at the project we're doing across town, I'd like to think it's less than that.
And which one is that?
We're doing Jeffrey's Neck Road.
Same kind of thing?
Same kind of thing, slightly different where they don't have to go, we're not going into the marshlands per se to achieve raising the road there, because they do have a shoulder slope that can be increased to gain the height. But that project's design and construction close to $2 million, so.
But it's longer too, isn't it?
I'd have to measure it. I suspect that combined it may be, but I'd have to, offhand, I'm not sure. I don't think it's drastically longer, to be honest. And again, we're looking at two totally different techniques to achieve raising the road between what I just explained as Jeffrey's Neck Road, and what we're looking at here is really using kind of soft solutions, living shorelines as a result to try to achieve raising the road. Where out there, you're going to see more revetment. You will see some soft solutions, but currently they're proposing more revetment than what we're looking at in this project.
We'll have some cost estimates available at the June meeting. So if you come back for the final meeting, we'll have those estimates available.
Are these going to be federal grants or state grants? Or?
Currently, it's a state grant that's not passed through the feds, is it? That's,
No.
yeah. So currently, it's federal, state funding, and it'll, from my guess is that it will stay that way. If we continue to seek funding, it'll likely be through the same source. There are some other grants that we could try to go for, but I feel like those other grants are more competitive with other town departments and their projects, where this one's a little less competitive for the types of things that you can do with it.
One thing that, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, what would happen if this road isn't elevated? Yeah. What are the consequences of just saying, okay, sea level rise is happening, we can't do anything?
I'd say you're gonna see it either degrade to non-use, which I doubt the town's gonna allow, so you'll see the town continue to repave it as it is today, and if, the stuff we're talking about isn't allowable and we can't raise the road, you'll eventually see it get replaced as is, because it needs to be replaced sometime in the near future, at least for now. It's getting pretty rough. So yeah, whether that happens in a handful of years and then another 5 or 10 years after that, I don't think a road will survive the useful life that a normal road would in those conditions. So I think doing nothing means more disturbance personally over the long haul, because you're repairing it more frequently than you need to, which is kind of what we're trying to get away from, the need to constantly be going back and making repairs. And as you see, it's tough. I don't know if there's any of the photos, but
Well, if you look at the Matt's figure here, you show, Matt, that there's already tidal excursions right over the road.
Yep.
And those will just become more frequent.
Yeah.
So just on the tides alone, it'll just be, you'll be able to pass through less frequently. It'll be closed off. But then the storms and as you get closer to 2070, it'll be more frequent.
And I think you said the project's not intended to mitigate against the biggest, baddest storms. It's intended to mitigate against nuisance flooding.
Exactly. It's just neither this project or Jeffrey's Neck is going to resolve any storm flooding. The storm surge is so high over these roads that it's not possible to build anything high enough to withstand those flooding conditions. But like they said, we are trying to limit the everyday, every height, maybe even if it's just the moon tides, the topping of the road from tidal only is what we're trying to achieve.
And we're designing the roadway cross-section to be able to be more resilient, so if it does get overtopped, when the floods subside, it won't be as damaged. So that's why we're looking at kind of stabilized, slopes on the side, as well as different pavement boxes on the top to help protect it in the future as well.
Do you know when that culvert was put in? What was that year?
I want to say like 2000 of that.
Oh, really? That was.
It's not that, yeah, it's
1998.
98.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And at the time, that was, they weren't far off with the information they had at the time
it's interesting.
for building on it. But you can see that it's still scouring pretty heavy. You look at the marshes, at the velocity it's coming in and going on a regular tide is a little more than what you want to see. And that's why just increasing it a little bit, kind of achieves some of that future scour effect in the marshlands.
So before that time, the road actually blocked the tide from coming across and into the marsh on the
I'm
other
not
side.
sure what, I feel like there was something in there, it just wasn't a box culvert, I suspect there was a couple of corrugated metal pipes or something. But
One
that
very
was
small
one
corrugated pipe.
Yeah. So, and that's, at the time to go from one small corrugated metal pipe to a 5x8 culvert is a substantial change. And, I don't think they're far off with the data they collected today. And they might have been spot on 20 years ago, I don't know, with the data they had. And I wonder if, the change had just been in our environment in the last 20 years that's made it all of a sudden slightly undersized. Any other comments, questions?
Are there other areas in Ipswich that you are not commenting or doing, but thinking might need to be done sometime in the future?
There are two other marsh, the Town Farm Road and Labor and Vein Road, both kind of cross a marsh. They're much shorter sections, but, this is kind of hopefully achieving a project like this, if it gets permitted and built and, it shows success, that hopefully we can then transfer those methods over to those roads. And that's what ultimately the goal of this is, not only in Ipswich, but in the Commonwealth. I think this road and this project was chosen because it's not the only road to a beach through a marsh. It might be in this town, but it certainly isn't in the East Coast here in Massachusetts. So I think the state is hoping that we can make some good progress here and transfer that to sites across the Commonwealth.
What about Water Street? I feel like it's budget.
Water Street is, again, we've looked at that. We're working on that through the same grant, different project, but that's not forgotten and just not something, again, Alicia from the Conservation Commission, she's working on a project on County Street, but the precursor to that project was looking at all of the river erosion from the head of dam to the last piece of town property on Water Street. So we identified 6 areas, really more, but we counted them as 6 groups and then did some subgroups of it. That's definitely one of the things, and we're currently working on some solutions to the stormwater aspects of that, but there are obviously some undercutting and scouring issues along the river that we'll continue to look at. And Alicia's project will hopefully provide some similar options to, like, if we can get that constructed and it all works well, maybe we can transfer that to another site, some of these other spots along the river that we're seeing the same kind of scouring problem. So that's also being looked at, separate, same grant, separate project, but it is also being looked at. Anybody else? Well, again, I thank you all for coming. I want to thank Carol 1,000 times over for her work. She's really helping us document the whole thing and helping us get the word out to you folks.